Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and so far I will say we've had a fantastic conference, and I'm going to clap to Bill. So let's get started. President John F. Kennedy once said, "The Chinese use two brushstrokes to write the word crisis. One brushstroke stands for danger, the other for opportunity. In a crisis, be aware of the danger, but recognize the opportunity." Now, while difficulties with China have not risen yet to the level of crisis, despite the looming tensions in South China Sea, relations with this rising power clearly present both dangers and opportunities. How we manage them will either precipitate or prevent a global crisis of major proportions. To discuss the dangers and opportunities represented in modern-day China, we have assembled a distinguished panel of experts. First, may I present Robert Daly, who has directed the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Wilson Center since 2013. A former diplomat, Mr. Daly also came to the Wilson Center from the University of Maryland. He served as American director of the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies. Now, one great fact that I found interesting about Mr. Daly, being a former public broadcasting journalist, is that he has worked on television and theater projects in China as a host, actor, and a writer. And in the 90s, he helped produce Chinese language versions of Sesame Street and other children television workshop programs. Yay, Sesame Street! So our next distinguished panelist is Erin Ennis. She is Senior Vice President for the U.S.-China Business Council. She directs government affairs and advocacy work for the Council, and prior to joining the U.S.-China Business Council, she worked at Kissinger McClarty Associates, where she advised international business clients on trade issues. She has had several positions in government, including serving as assistant to the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative and legislative aide to former U.S. Senator John Breaux from my original state of Louisiana. So, welcome. And we have also Bonnie Glaser, who is Senior Advisor for Asia and Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she focuses on issues related to China foreign and security policy. Ms. Glaser is a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, a senior associate with CSIS Pacific Forum, and a consultant for the U.S. government on East Asia. She does all of that at the same time. She has written extensively on Chinese foreign policy and serves on the board of the U.S. Committee for the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Take it away.
Well, good morning and thank you. We'd like to thank the World Affairs Council for having the three of us here today and giving us the opportunity to meet with all of you. The order of business is that I will lead off with an overview of the current situation in U.S.-China relations and the challenges ahead, speaking very broadly. We will then ask Bonnie to speak about the security side, including the South China Sea that you're all hearing a great deal about. And then Erin will discuss the extremely important trade and economic issues, including issues that you read about daily, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and reading a little bit less about the Bilateral Investment Treaty, or BIT. And then we look forward to hearing your views and taking questions. So we came into this thinking about the context of the talk, which is on the elections issues. And I think that you will hear in the candidates' rhetoric a reflection of the fact that the consensus in American China policy has been fraying over the past year or two. Some would say crumbling. And that consensus has been that constructive engagement with China, working as closely with China as possible in as many different fields as possible, to bring China into a network of international rules, norms, and best practices, that this policy of engagement needed to be one of the pillars of U.S.-China policy, if not the major approach to China. That idea is now under pressure and in some cases under attack from a growing number of people who are calling for a relationship characterized not by cooperation, but primarily by confrontation. And the relationship has always had both of these aspects. It's always been a balancing game. But the idea of engagement was that we would do what we could to sort of put a thumb on the cooperative side, if possible. And now these new voices are saying we need to recognize that through engagement, America has aided and abetted the emergence of a rival, an adversary. We've raised a tiger, and we need to call it an adversary and deal with it as such. And again, you'll see this in rhetoric. So we are perhaps, as a colleague of all of ours has said recently, at a turning point in US-China relations where these questions are being revisited. And it seems clear that the United States, in the midst of this turning point, does not really have a strategy, a grand strategy toward China. And I would argue that it's not clear that we could have such a strategy because the situation that we face is unprecedented. There has never been a power like the United States, which for all of the failures of some of our foreign policies is still able to become one of the primary strategic actors anywhere in the world, anytime, if we so choose. This is unprecedented, and we still have that ability. There has never been an era like the current one, as you know, in which information travels so fast to so many people, in which power and influence are dispersed among so many different kinds of groups, not only national leaders and militaries, but also NGOs, individual actors, non-state actors, and never been an era in which sovereign nation states were so deeply interconnected through commerce, technology, law, and cultural exposure. And then, not only has there never been a power like the US and an era like the current one internationally, of course, there has never been a rise like China's, which is unprecedented in its speed and scope. China is, unlike the Soviet Union, in a position where it could become a comprehensive power. The Soviet Union was a military power and therefore a political power, but never an economic power, and certainly didn't have much soft power. But China has the ability already as an economic power, as a military power, to perhaps become a comprehensive power, rivaling the United States. China, in the midst of this rise, too, I think we need to bear in mind, and this is often lost in our political rhetoric about China, China continues to change very, very rapidly. When we stopped talking about China's modernization and started talking about its rise, we put a lot of focus on our fears and a little less focus on the fact that everything is up for grabs, everything is in play in China. And while we know what some of China's goals are, my belief is that China itself is unsure ultimately of what kind of country it wants to become and can become, and therefore our judgments and actions, while they cannot be determinative, can play a role in shaping China. So it's an unprecedented situation. Despite all of the uncertainties in the relationship, however, we have to make our own call as we form strategy toward China about what we think the goals and intentions of China, by which we mean primarily the goals and intentions of the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP, are. And so I'll tell you what I think those are, and I think it's nearly a consensus view. You can tell me if this is wrong. I think the top goal of the party is, of course, stability, is for the party itself to stay in power in order to achieve what the party itself articulates as its top goal. They don't articulate their own stability as their top goal. They articulate their top goal as continued economic growth, and their second goal, which is secondary but growing in influence in China, is to increase China's international power. Specifically, when we look at a map of East Asia, it seems clear that the CCP would like to have at least a zone of deference in the Western Pacific, and at most a form of hegemony in the Eastern Hemisphere. That's what the CCP and many Chinese regard as their birthright and destiny, and it is what they would very much like to have. But our analysis of China can't end with China's ideal state of affairs and what China would like to have. Because, like us, China cannot have everything it wants, and it knows it. China is constrained. It is constrained by a daunting slate of domestic challenges, which includes an economy that is slowing down, demographics that are very much not in China's favor, a rapidly aging population, horrible problems with pollution, air, land, and water, an education crisis, a medical crisis, a crisis of public trust, of public safety, of safe food. It goes on and on. So a daunting list that will constrain China. China also has no allies, nothing like our alliance network that will help it achieve its goals. It has very nearly no soft power so far. China is furthermore surrounded by strong countries. It is often said that China wants to develop a Monroe Doctrine like the one that we had. But of course, we developed the Monroe Doctrine when we were surrounded by weak countries, countries that in no way matched us, whereas the countries on China's periphery, in terms of population, economic might, and military capacity, all surpass China combined, not individually. And they have the ability to balance and deter China when China grows too strong. And this is even before we add in the United States, which is by far the strongest nation in the region, which can also balance and deter. And then lastly, and most importantly, as China rises, and as China would, yes, like to dominate the region at some level, China is also constrained by the fact that despite the things you hear, which are true, about threats to the global commons in the South China Sea, Chinese cyber threats, intellectual property threats, China, in fact, benefits greatly from and contributes to current orders and knows this, doesn't want to upset those apple carts. So as we look at China in the election and afterward, the key question for developing our strategy is not what would China like. There are a number of alarmist writers now who have influence in Washington who focus on what China would like, namely it would like to be the big dog in East Asia, and take that as a fait accompli and want to arm up and run our strategy based on that. But the question is not what would China like. The question is what would China, in light of its ambitions, its intentions, its capabilities, and constraints, what will China settle for? That's the real question. And this, of course, is also the question for us, because we can't have everything that we would like to have in the region either, and we can get more into that in Q&A. So the question for strategy, I think, going forward is, how can the United States and other players, especially in the region, make allowances for China's legitimate desire for security and perfectly legitimate desire to have a greater say in shaping its security environment without, and I don't have an answer to this, I'm just posing the question, without sacrificing our core interests, without weakening our alliances, without undermining core principles of international law, and without emboldening China. That's the challenge for the next administration and administrations following that. And I have some specific recommendations, but I will stop there in the interest of time, and we can get to those when we get to Q&A. So, Bonnie.
All right, thank you, Robert. Pleasure to be here. These are a very important set of issues that we're talking about today. And I've been asked just to talk about security issues. So I want to start just by relating an anecdote. A few months ago, Chinese President Xi Jinping, as you all know, visited Washington, D.C., and at the State Department, they held this wonderful lunch for him. Secretary Kerry and Vice President Biden co-hosted. And the Vice President, in making his introductory remarks, used a phrase that we haven't heard for quite a long time, not since President George W. Bush was in power. He referred to our desire, the United States, to see China become a responsible stakeholder. And some of you may remember that was a concept that Bob Zellick, when he was Deputy Secretary of State, introduced. It's common practice, of course, in our country that when one party leaves office and the next one comes in, that they don't use the same terminology. But I can tell you, behind closed doors, lots of people continued to use that phrase. Because really, this concept is that China has the responsibility to strengthen the international system that has enabled its success. And so I was quite pleased, actually, to hear the Vice President bring this concept back into the open. The complexity of the U.S.-China relationship, I think, is unparalleled in history. Some people refer to this as the most important bilateral relationship. I don't, but I do see it as the most consequential. I would say that there are certain allies that we have that those relationships are more important. But consequential in the sense that if we have a positive, cooperative, successful relationship with China, then we can address many of the global challenges that we face. The failure to get this relationship right, obviously, is going to have a series of very negative consequences. The U.S. has worked well with China, I think, on some global issues where our interests either overlap or coincide. So we can look at things like proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, poverty, disease, climate change. The Iran nuclear deal would be another more recent example. But there are other areas in which our interests conflict. And I think that these are areas where we have to continue to work on, we have to manage them, but we also have to try and address them. And if we don't address these issues, then they're really going to fester, and they're going to undermine the relationship. And this is why some people have referred to the US-China relationship at a tipping point. China's rising, it's becoming more powerful, and it's beginning to use its capabilities in some ways that challenge, and it's not just American interests, in some ways it is much broader than that, and particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, I want to just address two of these security issues that were really at the top of the agenda when Xi Jinping was here. And the first is the use of cyber to steal intellectual property. So looking at this from the Chinese perspective, as Robert was just talking about, I mean, the Chinese want national rejuvenation. They want to become a great power. And they think that the use of espionage to help achieve that goal is legitimate. And so they do not distinguish between the use of espionage for what our president refers to as traditional intelligence purposes and stealing trade secrets. And this has been something that President Obama has worked on for several years. His administration, as well as personally in his conversations with Xi Jinping, to try and convince him of this distinction and why it is really not acceptable to steal another country's trade secrets. Many Chinese don't accept the fact that the United States doesn't steal trade secrets. I was in a meeting once I brought, when after Denny Blair stepped down from being DNI and we went to China, we were talking with a group of experts in the PLA, and one person asked him, you know, how do you convince me that the US really doesn't do this? And he said, well, you know, if we inadvertently came across some information, let's say on an advanced automobile technology, would we give it to Ford or would we give it to Chrysler? You know, we don't have state-owned enterprises that produce automobiles. We have companies. And so the reality is, he said, we don't do either. And we certainly don't have a dedicated policy that is seeking to steal intellectual property. Well, the Chinese, I think, lag in terms of innovation. And so they see that it's essential to steal trade secrets. Now, the United States and President Obama really got nowhere in this conversation until first we indicted 5 PLA officers, and then more recently threatened on the eve of Xi Jinping's visit to slap sanctions on Chinese companies that benefit from the procurement of stolen US intellectual property. So small progress has been made. Xi Jinping has accepted the distinction. He has said that going forward, neither China or the United States is going to use cyber to steal intellectual property. We will see whether that is put into practice. It appears so far that these actions continue unabated. But I think, you know, the lesson here, unfortunately, is that unless there's a real consequence, or at least a threat of a consequence for bad behavior, the Chinese appear to be unwilling to change their policy. So it's my view that in order to change the behavior, to have a more successful relationship, the US has to be willing to put its own skin in the game. We have to be willing to take risks. In this case, the risk is of retaliation. And that's something that I feel that if we are not willing to incur some risk, it is very difficult to convince the Chinese that we are serious. The second issue is the South China Sea. So again, trying to understand it from the Chinese perspective, just very briefly, the Chinese view the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea as their near seas. They have been invaded throughout history from the East Coast, And they are very concerned about potential threats to their interests through those waters. They see the situation in the South China Sea as unfavorable to China. Lots of countries occupied the bigger islands there before the Chinese had an opportunity. This is particularly true in the Spratlys, the northern area of the Paracels. The Chinese actually used force and took from Vietnam in the 1970s. But in the Spratlys, they occupy these reefs, most of which are underwater. So what we've seen in the last 2 years is that the Chinese have dredged sand on top of these reefs and built these very large artificial islands. And they are putting in long runways, radars, lots of potential installations for military ships. And even before they did that, their military presence, law enforcement presence has been growing in the region, and they've been using them for some coercive purposes. They seized one land feature in 2012 called Scarborough Shoal, not through force, but they did take it because they agreed to a political solution that they then did not implement. They've used intimidation tactics to scare neighbors, like installing an oil rig in Vietnam's waters in 2014. So essentially, I see Xi Jinping as his policy based on an assessment that a tougher approach in the near term will produce friction, but that in the long run, the neighbors will accommodate and make concessions and things will go China's way. And the neighbors, by the way, are really looking to us, the United States. Tom Donilon, when he was our national security advisor, used to talk all the time about the growing demand signal in the region. U.S. credibility is very much at stake. It's our interests and our credibility as a provider of peace and stability in the region, which we have done for approximately 7 decades. So again, my view is that we should try to shape an environment, shape China's choices, if you will, so that they will choose that the costs of pursuing this policy outweigh the benefits. And that is something that will take firmness, consistency, and patience. We have to have a set of policies, interagency, that are integrated, that cut across diplomatic, economic, and military areas. I think the administration has a coherent strategy, but the Chinese, I think, view the administration as being a little slow to step up, to develop this strategy, and really to be willing to impose costs on China in a way that, as I said, we incur risks ourselves. So I'll just close by saying, again, that I think if these issues like use of cyber to steal intellectual property, or the use of coercion in the South China Sea are not resolved, then I think we will see the bilateral relationship become much more contentious. I would argue that doesn't serve either U.S. or Chinese interests. And so these are issues we have to convince the Chinese that we're serious about, but I'm confident that over time, if we continue to stick to our policies, that they can be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Erin.
Maybe what I could do is start on the economic side, just kind of giving you some perspective about why China is important to the U.S. economy. China is now the second largest economy in the world. It will very likely overtake us by the end of the 2020s. That doesn't make it in itself important, but it certainly is a massive market for U.S. companies. At this point, China is the only economy in the world that's growing at any significant rate. Even if you take the lowest viable estimate that I've seen of around the low 6%, China's economy is still growing at almost twice the rate of the U.S. economy, and certainly faster than every other economy in the world. Now, that's not just a statistical issue for you to jot down. That's important because that's also where the growth is coming for American companies globally. The U.S.-China Business Council represents about 210 American companies doing business in China. We poll them every year about where China ranks in terms of the priorities they have globally and how China performs against all of those other markets. And China still is outperforming. Those numbers are getting smaller. If we were to have looked at the data about 5 years ago, China was outperforming every other market in the world by far, growing at approximately 10%. Companies were seeing double-digit growth rates. That's really important when you are a publicly traded company for your shareholders, but it also is important when you're trying to grow market share. Even with that slowdown to about 6% or give or take some, we're still seeing China outperforming other markets. And as a consequence, companies are looking to find ways to maximize how they still do business in a market that is incredibly difficult to do business in. Now, let me also give you that caveat. It is not easy to do business in China. It is incredibly complex. It is a place where China's government, in its effort not only to develop its global stature on other fronts, is also trying to develop its domestic industry. And frequently, that manifests itself in policies that either overtly or somewhat less so favor domestic companies. And yet, at the same time, companies tell us this is still one of their top 5 priority markets in terms of growth for the foreseeable future. What that means in terms of day-to-day business for companies is that we have to do what the favorite Washington phrase is, you have to play whack-a-mole on these issues. You have to both seek growth in as many areas as you possibly can in a very difficult market, and at the same time, you have to be able to go after the problems that are created by a system that does tend to favor domestic companies. That is not an easy challenge. I don't think it's contradictory. It certainly is not a difficult challenge to be able to point out to China where the problems are blatantly discriminatory and potentially in violation of global trade agreements. But frankly, the Chinese government has given us an incredible opportunity to be able to put issues in a context that we wouldn't have been able to create on our own, and that is its own efforts towards economic reforms. China in 2013, at the third plenum? Thank you. It has been 2 years now, sorry. Seems like just yesterday. Anyway, China in 2013 announced some pretty massive reforms of its economy that included allowing the market to make more decisions in terms of how they do business and allowing more foreign competition in the marketplace. It is great when you can make those kind of broad proclamations at the central government level. Getting that down to where the people are actually implementing it takes a little bit of time. China tends to do things in 5-year plans, so we are also kind of seeing some of the slowness in that. But we have begun to see some of the movement towards what those economic reforms could look like. Probably the most prominent example is China's renewed interest in negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with the United States. In Washington, if you haven't figured this part out yet, we live in a bit of an alphabet soup. So the BIT, Bilateral Investment Treaty, is an agreement between 2 countries, in this case the United States and China, once they complete it, based purely on investment, no other issues involved. So it's not going to get at the issues of whether we can import more product into China. It only has to deal with investment going on in the market and doing business there. As much as that is a narrow aspect of the trading relationship, the BIT negotiations offer an opportunity to go after some of the fundamental issues that weren't addressed when China joined the World Trade Organization about 15 years ago. In that, what a bilateral investment treaty requires you to do is provide equal treatment to domestic and foreign companies. That's something that, on paper, at least the WTO accession agreement provided for countries doing business in China, but in implementation it's been a challenge. But it also has an entire list at the back of sectors where governments preserve their right to discriminate. And it's called a negative list. Kind of think of it this way, rather than having how China approaches investment currently, of saying you as a foreign company can invest in any of these areas that I'm listing here, and here's how you can invest. It in some ways just flips the sentence around. You can invest any place that you want with these exceptions. Now, the key for that, and why that's important for the U.S., is that a bilateral investment treaty is going to have to be approved by the U.S. Senate. So a deal that doesn't significantly improve how much market access foreign companies have in China is never going to see the light of day. So negotiators have been working towards having that list be as narrow as possible and having as firm commitments on those national treatment obligations as necessary. That could be transformative, not just for how foreign companies access the Chinese market, but also how the Chinese market operates. Think about it this way. When China joined the World Trade Organization, one of the things that it agreed to do was largely open up its manufacturing sector to foreign investment. So in most cases, you as a foreign company can do business in China owning 100% of what you do there. There are some notable exceptions. In automobile manufacturing, you have to have a joint venture partner who owns 50% of it. But for the most of the rest of areas of manufacturing, you can own 100% as a foreign company. I think we can all agree that in the 15 years since China joined the World Trade Organization, opening up its manufacturing sector has not made it weaker. China is now arguably the largest and strongest manufacturing economy in the world. There is no reason to believe that opening up its services sector wouldn't do exactly the same thing and providing more opportunities for foreign companies in the market and by a result creating more competition and therefore forcing Chinese companies to become more competitive would be better for its economy. It will create more jobs. That's also essential to one of China's key economic reform goals, which is moving away from an economy that is dependent upon exports for growth and instead creating more domestic demand. Services jobs are everything from, the financial services that you buy, an insurance policy, banking, securities, but it also covers things like direct selling. Airbnb has recently opened up doing business in China, which creates an interesting new aspect of both electronic commerce in terms of what that does in a very dynamic market, growing in ways that even the US economy isn't growing on the internet economy. But also it creates an interesting aspect of new employment opportunities for people in that economy. These negotiations have been going on since the George W. Bush administration. It may have been part of the responsible stakeholder aspect. But they recently gathered speed because China agreed to approach these negotiations using the U.S. model. Earlier this year, prior to President Xi's visit to the United States, some significant progress was made in narrowing that list of restrictions that the Chinese were going to have. I think right now, both sides are focusing on the fact that the Obama administration will end its term at the end of 2016. And so the opportunity really is now to see how far China is willing to go on this. And that, as a consequence, is a top priority for American companies in this relationship. It is an incredibly important negotiation that I would encourage you to keep your eyes on. I'll just touch briefly on Trans-Pacific Partnership, which does not include China. I think that that too, however, can be a very useful and potentially transformative next step for China if it's able to successfully conclude a bilateral investment treaty with the United States. I was in China several weeks ago and talked with several of the key ministries and think tanks who are working on these issues. They asked a lot of questions about TPP, and the questions weren't from the aspect of why are you trying to contain us, why aren't we included? It was very much more so of tell us what's in it. We want to see how this might fit into our own economic reform plans. It would be very ambitious for China to join TPP right now. Its economy would not likely be able to immediately implement some of the key aspects of that agreement in terms of that equal treatment for foreign and domestic companies. But with that as a goal, and knowing that having a bit as a first step could show them the way to be able to make some progress, both internationally to show their legitimacy on these issues, but also domestically to show that opening up its economy and allowing more competition in these ways doesn't undermine the stability of the economy, but instead creates new growth opportunities, I think could be very useful. And so I think we should keep in mind that while we sell TPP in the United States as a way of not allowing China to write the rules, if we genuinely want an open global economy, China has to be a part of that agreement in hopefully the near future. Why don't I stop there since I probably have gone long and I know that Bonnie only has about 20 more minutes.
So we'd like to open it up for questions now. If we could front load it a little bit in terms of security issues. Bonnie has to leave for an important meeting right at 9:30, so we have plenty of time. It's not restricted to security, but again, if you have
Foreign policy is okay.
South China Sea, foreign policy, let's start with that. So at the back, do we have a wrangling mics? Okay. Yes, sir. Then we'll come up front. Oh, well, we'll come up front and then go out back. That's all right.
Jay Bruns, World Affairs Council of Connecticut. My question is really for Robert Daly. I was very interested in your comment about how China is constrained already by its powerful neighbors, even before you bring the U.S. into the mix. And so I was thinking about, India, Japan, Korea, Russia. Is there any evidence, other than probably in their newspapers you see there's some concern about China, is there any indication that they work together in any way on thinking about how to constrain China?
Well, first, they don't think only about constraining China. They also think very much about cooperating with China. China is the major trading partner for almost every nation in the region, and that relationship is very valued. Countries don't want to see a new US-China Cold War. They want to continue to build those relationships with China, and many of them are very interested not only in trade with China, but in China's growing capacity, potential capacity as a lender through things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and One Belt, One Road. So on the economic side, they value that relationship with China very, very highly. On the security side, the growing weight of evidence is that they prefer some version of the current dispensation in which the United States plays a major role. And yes, you do see, for example, India and Japan and Australia working more closely together, conducting some joint exercises. But some of these places also conduct joint exercises with China. So, but the answer is yes, that you see more interest of that sort, and you see some of these countries also buying more arms packages, including from Russia, which is China's security partner. So it's not a straightforward story, but clearly a number of nations in the region, yes, are looking to each other to buttress their own positions. But that's not a simple sort of good guy, bad guy, or bandwagoning story. It's more complex. So Bonnie, do you have anything on the?
I would just add that in terms of economics, as Robert said, every country in the region sees China as an opportunity and wants to benefit from the Chinese economy. In the security realm, there are countries that clearly favor the United States and want to use close relations with the United States to counterbalance China. This is not about containing China, it's about a balance. And so we are seeing more of those, not just what we used to see as the hub and spokes traditionally in the region, but more of the spokes cooperating with each other. Right. So Japan and India, Japan and Australia, Vietnam and the Philippines, both claimants in the South China Sea, are now doing more to cooperate with each other. So I think this is a relatively new trend in recent years, but there are definitely limits. No country really wants to put its economic ties with China at risk by growing its ties in the security realm with some of the other countries. And the exception there is the Philippines, which has filed a case with a court under UNCLOS regarding its
UN
territorial...
Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Yes, regarding its, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, regarding its maritime disputes with China. And the Japanese have very much stood up to China, but they're really exceptions.
Right. Sir, at the back.
Grant Hammond, Alabama World Affairs Council. China faces dozens of internal domestic challenges, as you've pointed out, as well as a series of foreign policy issues. Under the strain of such conditions, using the nationalist card is an optimal solution for an increasingly beleaguered party. How likely do you see that happening in the next decade, and what could or should the United States do to avoid being used or abused in that manner?
Nationalism. You want to take that first stab?
The Chinese have certainly used nationalism in the past, particularly, I think, at times when they felt they needed to forge domestic unity. And I often cite as the best example after the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989, and Japan was really the issue that, and it's lasted since then. For those of you who go to China, turn on the television, you will find many anti-Japanese dramas, on movies, on TV, and it's in the newspapers, and it's very much of a narrative. It is, I think that the government does less to actually promote anti-Americanism. There's criticism of some U.S. government policies. But I think they're actually less forceful in promoting that, in part because I think there's very positive views towards American, even though they dislike many American policies. There really are positive views towards Americans and our culture and society. But I find the last part of your question really to be the most interesting. What can the United States do? And I think it's important that we continue to state, as our president has and his predecessors, that we do not seek to contain China. We seek a prosperous, a successful, a stable China. Because the real narrative inside China is that the United States is trying to undermine the party, even overthrow it, destabilize the regime. We don't want to see China be successful and rise. I mean, that's nonsense. And our policies really don't support that narrative. But sometimes it's very difficult to get through, especially when the Chinese are blocking so many of our social media sites, as well as the New York Times and other newspapers. So the president has to try, I think, to speak directly to the people of China. Right. As difficult as that may be, we have to try to get these messages through.
If I could add something to that, then I want to ask you a question about whether there's growing economic nationalism, whether the business community see that. I agree with Bonnie that clearly we're not trying to contain China. We've played an enormous role that we can all be proud of in helping China to rise in a great many ways. At the same time, China's suspicions, I think that they misdefine them, but they're not altogether wrong. We don't want to contain China. We would rather like to change China. And they sense this. We're very interested in China's becoming more of a liberal democracy, in it's changing its political system, changing its values, changing its institutions, which on all of these desires on our part are very much China's benefit. But if you're a Communist Party official and your top priority, as I said, is maintaining a monopoly on power in an authoritarian state, these prescriptions for civil society, transparency, free press, academic freedom are in fact prescriptions of suicide pills. So we don't want to contain China, but they're not altogether wrong that we have attitudes toward China which would be harmful to what at least the government sees as its interests. I think we do want to change China. I mean, this is from 200,000 feet or from outer space. I'm answering this question, but the Chinese aren't entirely wrong about some of our attitudes. But what about economic nationalism? Is it rearing its head?
I don't know that it ever didn't. China. Let me kind of flip it around. It is not unusual for a government to want to favor its domestic companies. We certainly in the United States have plenty of ways where we like to see U.S. products when you are having a government contract or having a road built or a bridge or those kinds of things. So in some ways, you have to balance that when you're dealing with international economics. We allow under international trade rules some ability to be able to do that. Buy America is allowed under WTO rules, but we do have to give equal treatment to any other government who's a member of the WTO's government procurement agreement. China's not a party to that right now. So in some ways, more of the use of the international economic structure could get at some of these issues by enforcing new rules against them. But we certainly are seeing a lot of policies that are more domestically focused coming out of China. I don't know that I think that it is a genuinely well-coordinated effort within China's government for these. And I say that because in many cases, when these policies come up, you can identify that they either are clearly counter to something that China has otherwise committed itself to do, or counterproductive for a goal that it wants to have. And by seeking out the people who you know are promoting economic reforms, understand what China's obligations are, understand the broader commitments, then you actually find allies who can help you to go about trying to find some ways to make progress on them. The best example of that I can give you is that late last year, early this year, China's banking authority put out some regulations that would have required banks to change their technology to use ones that meet China's new standard of how technology was going to be judged, secure and controllable. The term is actually yet to be fully defined. You can imagine in a technology world what the secure might mean. I mean, obviously, if you're dealing with banking data, you want to make sure that your customer data has been protected. The controllable part, not as easy to understand where that's going, and certainly a lot of concerns about what that means in the context of how China might implement that policy. It was accompanied by various provisions that would require technology to be tested by the central government and allow them to have access to source codes. Well, not only is that a poor policy in terms of how technology should be done, but it also runs counter to actually having secure banking information, which was the whole point of the policy. And it probably violated some WTO rules that China had. Over the course of the last 9 to 10 months, we have seen progress, though, by seeking out the folks who were less concerned about the security side and the idea of using domestic technology that could meet these issues, and more of a recognition that the better way to regulate technology for security purposes is doing it on a risk assessment basis. Because every bank has a different set of customers. They all have different types of business that they do. That's true not only of domestic US banks, but also of Chinese banks that may be seeking to go overseas. And so actually, as a part of the President Xi's visit, some of the outcomes included commitments to move away from those types of policies. This gets into the whole whack-a-mole issue that I mentioned. There is, I think, a sentiment in China that does want to favor domestic companies. But I don't think that it is going to be, it's not one that is sufficiently well ingrained in the overall goals that China has on economic reforms that it can't be pushed back.
Right. There was a question over here, sir. And then we'll come right next door. You, ma'am.
Thank you. Rich Becker from the Western Massachusetts World Affairs Council. And about a year ago, I had the opportunity to go to China with Bill Clifford and some other people in this room to meet with some of the highest, the people at the highest level of government. And one of the themes that we saw at that time, and we were told by one person after another, as well as confirmed by our own ambassador, Max Baucus, is that within China, there's a huge debate also. Should they work more closely with the United States? Is the United States our friend, or is the United States our enemy? And what we kept hearing over and over again was a theme of don't embolden our nationalists. And that meant, how do you embolden the nationalists? By appearing to tell China what to do, as opposed to trying to work with China as an equal. So we heard that over and over again, and I just wanted your comments on that.
Bonnie?
Go ahead.
Well, I think it's both true and disingenuous, because they become the sole, they exercise the sole right to determine whether we're preaching or whether we're being constructive, right? And so it's actually an attempt to sort of mold discourse and limit us, and we do see this claim, and we hear more and more from Chinese interlocutors that they, the Chinese government, are but passive implementers of the will of the people, and that they now respond to netizens and public opinion, and therefore we need to be careful about what we do to upset the Chinese because they can't do other than respond to the will of the people. Now, on the one hand, there is some truth that they are more responsive, and the internet does make a difference. But it is also true that they dismiss public opinion when they want to, and that they have long molded it and continue to mold it. And it is true that Xi Jinping has considerable, I would say enormous political capital to shape the discourse. So I say there's nothing to the claim, but I experience it as a little bit disingenuous. Bonnie, you've been in these conversations.
Great answer. I don't disagree with any of that.
They weren't talking about the people, they were talking about within the government.
Yeah, but it's the same. It gives them, because again, only they understand the people in the government and the nationalists, and therefore they can define it. And whenever we say something that they don't like in policy matters, whoa, watch it with that one. You know, you'll incite our nationalists, and there's nothing I can do. Well, this is essentially, putting a gag on you. We do need to be careful about how we phrase our representations to the Chinese, yes, but that's always been true.
I'd like to assert a little bit of executive privilege in two ways. One is that I'd like to hear some questions from our scholarship students. That's after this one, which is the other part of my privilege, and specifically to Bonnie because
Yes.
you're leaving. In addition to that trip to China, this summer, not long after CSIS hosted Madam Tsai Ing-wen of the opposition Democratic Progressive Party, we made a trip, and it was about a month before the KMT had its election for a candidate who's no longer in the running. I'd like to understand how that election in January is going to shape Taiwan mainland relations, and also what you feel about the summit that just happened between President Xi and President Ma.
Thank you for that question, and I think it's really important. In fact, the KMT's new candidate is in Washington as we speak, meeting with officials and think tank experts today. And as you said, Taiwan's President Ma Ying-jeou just met with Xi Jinping, the first time these leaders from the estranged sides of the strait have met in 66 years. And it is truly remarkable. But I think if we look at the polls, the dissatisfaction with the current president, his poll numbers in Taiwan are really in sort of the low 20s. He's been in power for 8 years, and as we all know, many publics, after they've experienced a president for 8 years, they want to change. And that's what democracies do. And so they will have an election on January 16th, and it is quite likely that Tsai Ing-wen will be elected. Of course, not a certainty, but her poll numbers remain quite strong. She leads by about 20% in the polls. And her predecessor, the first ever president from the DPP in Taiwan, who was in power from 2000 to 2008, pursued some provocative policies that were seen as provocative not just by mainland China, but also by the United States. And it was not a good period in the U.S. relationship with Taiwan, because the U.S. really does have an abiding interest, not only in supporting democracy and security in Taiwan, but also to ensure that there is stability across the strait. Because if tensions rise and the risk of war increases, there is a possibility that the United States gets dragged into that. And if the Chinese were to use force against Taiwan, that would be quite different. If they did it for no good reason, it would be quite different than Taiwan pursuing a policy that then provoked a military response from Taiwan. So this is a time where we were very diplomatically active. And so I think that looking forward, I think it's quite unlikely that Tsai Ing-wen as president would pursue similar policies as her predecessor Chen Shui-bian did. But on the other side of the strait in the mainland, we have a very confident leader who has been very tough against every one of China's neighbors. He has been willing to, particularly on sovereignty issues, take very, very tough positions. So I'm less concerned about her being provocative than I am concerned about a response from the mainland. And very briefly, what I expect is that the channels that they use for communication, including now governmental channels and, of course, meetings of senior leaders, that those would be suspended. I think that mainland China would be likely to establish diplomatic ties with several of Taiwan's allies, and right now they're down to 23, most of them very small countries. But that would be something that I think would happen very quickly, because some of these countries really want diplomatic relations with China. And there have been a lot of tourists going from the mainland to Taiwan. I think that as senior Chinese officials tell me, our people won't want to go to Taiwan anymore. In other words, they will stop them from visiting Taiwan. And Taiwan won't be able to sign free trade agreements and will be further marginalized from regional economic integration. Perhaps China will block Taiwan's bid to join TPP in the next couple of years, as well as the regional comprehensive economic partnership. So I think that we could see cross-strait relations become tense, not in the same way as when Chen Shui-bian was president, but I expect that after this election, we will see U.S. diplomatic involvement step up, and there is an opportunity, I think, to find some common ground, but I worry about it. This issue has not been on the U.S.-China agenda now for almost a little bit less than 10 years. And with all these other issues that we have where we're trying to negotiate the bit, and we're talking about South China Sea and cyber issues, when Taiwan becomes a problem in the U.S.-China relationship, it crowds out all these other issues, and we are less able to effectively manage the relationship. So that becomes a problem.
Could we get one last quick question for Bonnie from one of the fellows? Do we have such a question? Yes, sir.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tim Williams. I'm the Alaska World Affairs Council. I have a quick question in terms of like security. China has been recently like increasing like foreign direct investment in Africa, and that's like the implications of that involve oil, and if that comes down to it, control of like the resources such as oil have major implications in warfare. So what's your take on China's investment in like these strategic locations in Africa with presumed large amounts of oil reserves?
The Chinese are very, I think, insecure about energy supplies, and they have long believed that the way to ensure those energy supplies is to go by the wells rather than just buy oil on the open market, which is what most countries do. Now, the Chinese also buy oil and gas on the open market, but they have seen it as strategic to go into countries and actually buy this at the source. I think over time, they may learn that this is actually riskier. If you have political unrest in a country and you've bought into the oil, you may find that you can't get that oil out. And it's really much safer to buy it on the open market. And I haven't looked at the data, so I don't know if they are beginning to learn that lesson. But I think ultimately that is the lesson that they should draw. Of course, they've done other things to ensure energy security. They've built their own strategic reserve of oil, which 10 years ago didn't exist. So they've gradually filled those oil reserves so they don't have to be so panicked that somebody could cut them off and they wouldn't have enough oil. I don't know how many days they have. Maybe it's something like 20 days would probably be typical, maybe a little bit longer. And then, of course, pipelines, so that they're not as reliant on the sea. When Hu Jintao was in power, they talked about the Malacca dilemma, where they would have the potential that the United States could blockade the Malacca Strait and wouldn't be able to get their oil through. So they've tried to build more of these pipelines. Getting oil, for example, from Burma, Myanmar, through pipelines into China. So I think this is a lesson, sort of, and there are many of these types of lessons, I think, that China has to learn as they emerge and become less insecure and more confident about their ability to work the international system to their favor. And there are some ways where China is blocked from doing that. Our Congress won't vote China to have more voting shares in the World Bank. You know, that's a problem, and the IMF. And China's tried to deal with this by setting up their own bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But that still doesn't help them in terms of getting more voting shares. So I think that China in some ways is learning how to work the international system to their favor. But energy is critical for the Chinese. And their FDI is going to certainly continue. And in some ways, I'm sure that Erin could talk about China's FDI into the United States, into Europe. This is good, creates jobs. We may have some sector of national security where we don't want the Chinese to invest in, but those are really small sectors. In fact, you can go out around America, talk to mayors and people, local officials, and China's creating jobs places.
Would like to, Bonnie has to run to another meeting, but I would like to thank her for her time this morning. Bonnie, xie xie.
Nice to see you, Bonnie.
Yes, sir, back of the room.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Kovac from the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. What's the significance of the large amounts of foreign direct investment China is doing across the world, really, in Africa, especially in Central America, such as in Nicaragua, with interest in building an entire new canal?
Well, right, so China is it, I find that if we turn, you can't hear my lapel mic. Does this work better if I just hold this and treat it? Okay. I think we should do this. I noticed with Bonnie, when she turned her head, all of a sudden she was going on and offline because of the location of the lapel mics. China has an enormous need for natural resources. Okay, this is not nefarious. They have a population of nearly 1.4 billion. And as Lester Brown of the World Watch Institute said, 1.4 billion times anything equals a whole hell of a lot. These are people who are getting wealthier and who want for their lives more or less what we want for our lives. This is a big problem. Different estimates show that if the entire world had the material existence of the American middle class, we would need 5 to 10 Earths worth of natural resources to meet that demand. So what do you do with that? I mean, you can invoke the technology genie, and some people do. They say that, well, if there's a demand and there's a problem, human ingenuity will somehow solve it. But there's only so much stuff, right? So China now has the purchasing power to get the natural resources it needs. And energy is at the top of the list, but so are a number of other natural resources and metals, and so are food supplies and grains. And they want to, so they are very interested in investing in Africa, in South and Central America, to build the infrastructure, which includes the ports, the railroads, that can supply the Chinese people with the things that they, again, legitimately need. We have a tendency to paint everything that China does as somehow nefarious. These are human needs, right? So, but the issues have been, as China goes into Africa and South America, they've had a little bit of a tendency to overpromise. Leaders will go in and promise tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, which tend not to materialize. And there have also been problems with the ways that some of their investments are received. And there have been accusations of neo-colonialism in both Africa and South America and Central America, with local critics saying what China is doing is extracting raw materials and selling back to us finished goods made with our raw materials, and that was the essence of colonialism. Furthermore, this is the negative side of Chinese investment. It tends not to be very solicitous of local views or to protect the environment, and many Chinese companies hire Chinese corporations to come in and do the work, so they don't necessarily spread jobs around. So you do see major efforts to build, for example, railways through the Amazon from coast to coast in South America, to build a new canal through Nicaragua, which will have about twice the carrying capacity of the expanded Panama Canal. And you hear these criticisms of China as it expands. From the United States point of view, I worry that we take a little bit too much comfort in these accusations about what China does wrong. And we miss the fact that, I mean, and Bonnie's mentioned this, I think Erin alluded to it, that China listens and China learns. China changes its tactics. It is extremely sensitive to accusations of neo-colonialism, because colonialism is an accusation that it flings at the rest of the world. So China learns, it changes its structures, and I think, too, that we sometimes like to hear Africans and South Americans calling China names, and we take solace in that and ignore the fact that we actually don't have very strong policies, economic policies toward Africa and South America. So we need to get our own house in order. Broad answer. Maybe up here up front? I think, yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Morning. Good morning. Yes? Can you hear me? Okay. Diane Conroy-Lasavita from the International Center of the Capital Region, Albany, New York. And I have a question in regards to the educational crisis in China. And the reason I am concerned or interested in this particular topic, recently, this past year, we have really been besieged or overwhelmed with requests of trying to place Chinese students in upstate New York public high schools. Very specific, achieving public high schools. And it has surprised me on how much parents are willing to pay to place students. And we've had quotes everywhere from about $43,000 to $70,000 annually to place these students as young as 12.
Right. Well, as a graduate of an upstate New York public high school, outside of Syracuse. Yes, this is, we read a lot about Chinese graduate students and now a huge wave of undergrads, but they're also coming younger and younger, as young as elementary school, often with only one parent or in some cases no parents. And a number of public schools have discovered that you can charge tuition to let these students in. And I think the jury is very much out on whether this is in fact a good thing for the students, whether they're prepared or not, or for the schools themselves. The students themselves, of course, being blameless. It's a question of what our policies might be, but this is an underreported story. And schools see the money that these students can represent. And in my experience, which is largely anecdotal with this, I say the reporting hasn't been done, they don't ask questions about whether these students are really prepared and supported, both logistically and psychologically, to succeed in the American public high school environment, which I tell you is radically different from the Chinese public high school environment. I think we need to be very careful for the students' own sakes and for our own. But there's no coordination of this. It happens school district by school district based on decisions which mostly I think have to do with chasing after those tuition dollars. But you should keep asking the question because the story's underreported and it's not adequately understood. It's right in the middle and then over here to the corner. Yes.
My name is Yi Sun from Worcester World Affairs Council. First, I want to say I was grow up in China, and then I really enjoy watching Sesame Street.
Oh, good. Glad to hear it.
And then I actually have two questions. My first question is during Xi's visit in US, he actually mentioned about establishing a new model for major countries in the world and create this win-win situation for both US and China. So my first question is, do you think it's feasible for US and China to focus more on the opportunity and similarity while having this difference to exist? And my second question, in response to the previous question, is like many Chinese students now studying in the US, now China is going to support 1 million US students to study in China. So do you think what's the future for the cooperation in education? Thank you.
Sure, I'll take the first one. So the new model of major country relations wasn't actually new for this visit. This is something that President Xi's been talking about almost since he came to office. And it may have started a little bit before that even, if I'm going back in my time.
He mentioned it when he was still a vice president.
All right, so there you go. So that would take him back to probably about 2012. I think that the answer to the question is yes, I think it's possible, and frankly, we all need to be doing everything we possibly can to make the relationship between the United States and China work. I think the alternative is something that none of us will like what the outcomes are of. We not only as an economy cannot afford to go into a new Cold War with any country around the world, certainly not the other major economy in the world. We certainly don't want a hot war with another country in the world at this point. I do think, though, that even taking into account some of the suggestions that Bonnie had made about a willingness to move forward on issues when they might have consequences for us, I think it's possible to do that with an eye on where you want to go. The cyber is a really good example of it. I don't think that U.S. industry would have as much of a concern about the impact of retaliation if the U.S. were to start taking actions on cyber issues if we knew that we were heading towards a goal that was going to either alleviate the problem in the future or have a sufficiently punitive system in place where you would see a curbing of cyber attacks. Interestingly, there actually may have already been a curbing of it. FireEye, which is a cybersecurity firm that had made its name for helping companies address when their systems had been hacked by the Chinese, actually filed last week, I believe it was, in its SEC filings that their earnings for the third quarter of 2015 were off because of a reduction in the number of Chinese cyber attacks that they were going after. So again, I think the goal here is you have to find that balance, the opportunities and finding ways to work together, but also having your eye on the prize of where you want to go and understanding what that path is so that the consequences that you might incur during that part aren't simply collateral damage. You're actually going towards a place where the relationship ultimately is going to be in a better place.
On the education side, the program that you're referring to, which was announced during Xi Jinping's visit, is called 1 Million Strong. It follows on a previous program that President Obama announced called 100,000 Strong, which was about getting more students, American students, to go to China for study abroad opportunities. 1 million strong, the idea of this is that you'll have 1 million American school-age students actually studying Chinese as part of their curriculum. On the one hand, I think that this is long overdue. One of the things that, we look at the panoply of problems with China, and it's really daunting. You say, well, what can we do unilaterally that makes any difference at all? And I've long felt that one of the most important steps we could take is Chinese language programs in public schools, grades 1 through 12. Now, obviously, that's a call not only for Chinese, but for taking foreign language studies seriously as a part of curricula. And this also comprises, of course, Spanish, which needs to be number 1. I would argue that Chinese should be a close number 2, but Arabic, other languages as well. So I'm sorry to be a China head on this one, but taking China as the example, it's extremely important. If we are going to meet the challenges that China offers and the opportunities that you mentioned across the board, we need to know that we are training a large group of people across the professions throughout their careers who are culturally and linguistically competent in China and Chinese. That's a very constructive national goal. It serves individual interests in that anybody whose Chinese is really good is going to have more opportunities. It serves local interests in that local school boards that have these curricula in place are going to be able to attract more Chinese FDI. And it suits national interests in that we cannot respond to China coherently unless we first understand China on its own terms, and that requires deep linguistic and cultural study. So that's the case for 1 million strong. It's an unfunded mandate. It is a good wish. There's no congressional appropriation behind this. And that means they're going to be fundraising for it, and that it's mostly not going to happen unless people are activist about this with their local school boards in making the case, because that's how you get curricula into public schools. And usually foreign language programs are the first things to be cut when you've got budgetary constraints, and every school district has budgetary constraints. So this is going to be a long slog and a long fight in which, if I could get up on a soapbox, the World Affairs Council could probably make a difference. This is something you can do.
Yeah. If I could just add an endorsement for 100,000 Strong, which is the foundation that will be taking on this, this effort. It's not just a matter of the funding for getting these programs into schools. There aren't enough Chinese language teachers in the United States. There actually isn't a unified curriculum to be able to get students from K through 12, to be able to be certified, to be able to kind of get through all those processes. So this is one of those areas that if it is of interest to your local councils, I'm more than happy to give you the contact information for 100,000 Strong. I am sure they would love to hear from you.
And we could do this for about the cost of 1 additional Virginia-class submarine. So bear that in mind. Yes?
Thank you. Rachel Powerstein, World Affairs Council of San Antonio. China is a place of extensive cultural and ethnic diversity, but it's not necessarily always willing to accommodate that. Do you think that China is anywhere close to liberalizing its approach to instability in places like Xinjiang province?
No. It's a great, easy question.
Next.
No, that's very, very threatening to China. They throughout much of Chinese history, what we now call Xinjiang was actually not part of China proper. It wasn't part of the Ming Dynasty maps. It didn't become a part of China, roughly speaking, until the Qing Dynasty after 1644. But it was a source of invasion for China, and so it's a buffer for China now. And it's very clear that they are coming down with an ever harder hand on Xinjiang, on Tibet. They've got issues obviously of a different sort in Taiwan and Hong Kong, but trouble at the periphery, and there is no sign of a more open-handed liberal policy, quite the opposite.
Several military studies all agree that if there was a war with mainland and Taiwan, they would knock out the airfields in a matter of hours, rendering Taiwan defenseless. They now have 1,500-mile anti-ship missiles. How realistic is it that the United States would come to the aid of Taiwan if push came to shove?
Well, this is an extremely difficult question. I think it would depend a lot on how this was precipitated, but you're right about the essence of the dilemma that we face. We have the capability to, to use military speak, sort of counter some of this and in some cases prevail, that language is actually code for Armageddon, in my view. We're really talking about, World War III. As you say, they have these missiles that can take out our aircraft carriers, we think. That has to be our operating assumption, that take out our platforms. The way to counter that is to take out the missiles before they can be fired. The missiles are located along Chinese major cities. I mean, this becomes, as I say, this is Armageddon. And so I have not heard a coherent answer to that question. It's about managing the relationships before the fact such that what you have just described, which is foreseeable in terms of capabilities, never occurs, because the answers to this is really World War III. It's not a limited scenario.
As an Asianist, I really hate to do this. I want to thank Robert and Erin and Bonnie for an excellent panel.